Welcome very, very much to Conversations. Well, we're pleased to welcome to the program a guest, Professor Robert Viscusi, who's with the CUNY University of New York, Brooklyn College thereof. He's a student of, among other things, Christopher Columbus that we want to talk about, this being carried on Columbus Day 1994. He's the, also, I might just say, the president of the Italian American Writers Association. He's a student of Humanities, and Professor Viscusi and Robert, if I may, welcome very much to Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
We're taping this on the Friday before, or the Thursday before, the official commemoration of Columbus Day here in 1994. And we want to talk about the man and talk about the event, which I see as an incredibly important event, the voyage, the first voyage of Christopher Columbus. But I wonder if maybe you want to comment on it in general. We passed the 500th anniversary of this event, and there wasn't the kind of celebratory kind of nature to this that many people anticipated from years ago as we came up to it. There was a great deal of difficulty because it came to represent, in a certain sense, in the minds of many, a clash between the advantaged and disadvantaged peoples of the world. But I wonder in general if you want to comment on it. We've gone 502 years now since that memorable event, and I wonder just generally you want to comment on sociologically the attitude, the importance of it, and then how we can perhaps just understand the significance of that first journey that he took across the Atlantic Ocean.
Well, you said to me before we started that I look like a professor. Your question makes me feel like a professor because you asked me the same question about three things that are in fact extremely different. One of them is the way in which we're celebrating Columbus Day today, or next Monday. The second one is the way we used to celebrate Columbus Day. And the third one is what happened in 1492. Those are three very distinct things.
Interesting. Okay.
Let's start with the second one.
Okay.
The way we used to celebrate Columbus Day reached its paradigm, its peak, in 1892. With the Columbian Quadricentenary, they had a great exposition. Columbus represented, for many Americans of every provenance, the triumph of America, the hopes of America, the power of America, which was becoming at that point self-consciously global. In 1992, instead, Columbus came to attach, the figure of Columbus came to attach to itself many of the doubts about that same global mission of America, which had been fermenting in the United States really since the Vietnam War. So the meaning of Columbus as a figure in 1992 was extremely different, almost directly opposed to what it had been
almost
180
degrees
earlier.
Yeah.
Neither of those two things has very directly much to do, in my judgment, with what happened 500 years ago, which is a whole separate issue and can be looked at from one angle or from another, but it seems to me that our frames are much closer to our vision than what it is that we're looking at. And our frames have to do with where we stand in the history of the United States of America. And it is through those positions in time that we tend to think about this symbolic intersection, which we call by the name of a man.
Right. Now, how do we account for this change in the 100 years, do you think? And I might just say if it's East-West, that was a meeting of the East and West that Columbus represented, a meeting with the indigenous peoples on San Salvador, that debate or that sense may be taking a form now between, it's rather more the East and the West, it's rather more North and South. We're in the middle of these GATT agreements now, we're in the middle of these World Trade Organization, the well-to-do nations of the world are coming against the less well-to-do, the less developed, and so, do you understand what I'm saying? It's sort of a North-South sort of quality to this East-West conflict that's seen to develop in the 100 years since 1892, as you say.
North-South is the way that we recode it as geography. That, I think, is largely owing to another Italian, Antonio Gramsci, who dramatized the notion of the South, really beginning with the south of Italy itself, the Mezzogiorno, as the type of the colonized and oppressed culture. What's really going on now, and has been going on, I think, really since the Vietnam War, has been that the people who lived under what Gramsci would have called the denial or deprivation have started to speak for themselves. They are speaking back. In 1892, I have seen testimonies from some groups that in 1992 protested very strongly against the celebration. In 1892, sometimes they were protesting because they weren't being included centrally enough.
I see, right.
Because it meant something so, as you pointed out, diametrically opposite 100 years earlier.
Right. And it's interesting that is that's going on. This change has gone on in the perception of the world. The fact that he had gone, I kind of, well, there's a number of ways we want to talk about. You have a sort of epic poem you've written that we want to talk about. I want to give you a chance to read some of and let people know you're going to actually be reading that on the night that this program is aired downtown, where people might want to get to that. And you've also been interested in that. But I've been interested, and I wonder if I could maybe just talk a little bit about it the way I see it as a geographer. And it just seems to me that that we ought to try and get a perspective on it in a world scale. I mean, a lot of things have gone on since 1892 in terms of our understanding. The whole question of the evolution of the human species has gone through incredible revolutions, Australopithecine and the development of Homo habilis, and the fact that we seem to have come to almost universal agreement that mankind as a species first evolved and developed and was shown to develop along probably the eastern Rift Valley of Africa, and very likely of mitochondrial DNA studies, which seem now to be accepted or correct, probably about 200,000 years ago, that we come all, 5.5 billion people in the world today, come from a common small ancestral gene pool in the east of Africa, and that's the original home of us all. Now, if we look at a world scale, mankind was very, very effective in terms of being able to move eastward. I figured it out, and that if we go from that original route, the people who were the precursors or the ancestors, the intrepid ancestors of the American Indian or indigenous people, had gone 280 degrees of longitude to the eastward. They had managed to cross the Pacific over the Bering Strait or whatever, and those people who were on the island of San Salvador as Columbus approached it on October 11th, the night of October 11th, they had come perhaps 75 degrees of the way, around 70% of the way, in a circumnavigating of the globe in an eastward direction. If you take their cousins in Brazil, they'd gone virtually 95% of the way around the world in an eastward migratory pattern. To the west, we'd been very much less able to do that. The Europeans themselves had hardly ventured more, at the very most, even from the original site where we originated, not more than 10% of the way around the world. They had ventured hardly at all into the in a western direction. But the meeting of Columbus, the Vikings notwithstanding, possible transatlantic contact from Africa, Phoenician or other kinds of legendary or other kinds of thoughts notwithstanding, the meeting of Columbus on that day of October 12th or October 11th, how we read it, was a monumental meeting up of the easternmost and the westernmost extensions of mankind from our original place. Does that make sense to you, or is that something that you can see in a broad kind of context, and does it have any meaning at all?
Well, the picture that you draw is clear enough. It's hard for me to understand exactly what it means. You are thinking very much as if you were looking over the shoulder of God Almighty.
Right, a little bit like that.
I, on the other hand, grew up in Long Island City, and I live in Brooklyn. And my purview is considerably more parochial, I suppose, than yours is. When you get back into the past, beyond where there's written records, it seems to me that the possible narratives that you can generate, the number of possible narratives you can generate, is sort of infinite, because there's so little to hold you back. You have this and you have that, and you connect the dots this way or that way. There's a quite brilliant writer named Gerald Vizenor, a Native American writer who's a professor at Berkeley, who published a novel around the time of the quincentenary, which was called The Heirs of Columbus. And one of the premises of this was that Columbus was himself descended from Native Americans who had migrated eastward.
That's pretty strange.
It is strange, and I'm sure
that's really strange.
it's
I've
sort
never
of,
heard that.
Well, I don't think it's a serious.
Yeah, right.
I think it's a satire.
Right. Oh, I see.
Of
Okay.
the kinds of narratives that we're likely to weave about history before there is writing, because it's hard to know really when we have enough constraints to make the story that we've made really compelling. It's always easy to make a shapely story. We understand the art of doing that well enough. The meaning of this particular event, however, can scarcely be overstated.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to... Morrison says, Admiral Morrison says, this was the most monumental night in the history of mankind, in a certain sense, since the birth of Christ. No night was so propitious as October 11th, as these people bore down, because we were closing the gap, but we were closing the circle, in a certain sense, on what had been an eastward and a westward direction. And if we're thinking in terms of the coming together of mankind, that was a monumental event that was taking place 500 years ago.
There, though, again, I think you're closer to the shoulders of the Lord than I am. Let me explain to you what I mean, though. The notion of what it means in terms of world history and what its value in terms of world history could be, such a notion is, for me, really very hard to reach out to. I'm familiar with that way of thinking. I've read Morrison and many of the other great historiographers, and I understand at least a little bit what they mean. For me, though, the part about Columbus that is compelling, and the part that preoccupied me in writing what I wrote, and really what I think about when I think about it, and it is an important subject to me, is what it means to people here and now. This is not to make an assertion about the value of the historical event. Clearly, huge consequences flowed from this. Now, you're looking at it from the point of view of global history. I'm more inclined,
and the contemporary.
I'm more inclined to look at it from the point of view of the history of the Italians.
All right. Well, he was an Italian.
Not just that he was an Italian,
1451.
but there were so many of us afterwards who went through a whole set of historical processes which had very little, if anything, to do with him, but had a lot to do with the forces that propelled him, had a lot to do with the forces that developed the United States and eventually produced the labor market in which Italians migrated to the United States in huge numbers, and then found themselves, paradoxically, ironically, and self-contradictorily, these people who were laborers and very poor people, impoverished migrants, found themselves best symbolized by this person who was the agent, the paid agent of the King of Spain, and a lot of very rich bankers from Florence.
Well, he got the backing from Spain. He'd been able to get the backing from Spain. And it was a monumental venture that he did.
Indeed.
33 days into unknown seas. They had never gone that far from the Canary Islands. And it was a monumental adventure. But I think it's also good to underscore the fact that these other intrepid peoples who were in the New World, the indigenous peoples, had virtually circumnavigated the world. 95% of the way around the world in an eastern direction. I think that their due ought to be brought into account too. The Europeans had hardly ventured away from where our original roots were. I think that's an important content. And I wonder if I could bring up one of the things I've discovered. I mentioned it to you on the telephone, preliminary conversation. We want to get to your poem also, of course. Is an interesting kind of thing, because we come into a world now where I mentioned to you before the GATT agreements and these kind of worlds, and there's a tremendous development of technology, and all kinds of things have developed since these 500 years since Christopher Columbus. We live in a very precarious world in a certain sense, and we live in a world that Marshall McLuhan called a global village. So the linking of these two things, and there increasingly a world economy is emerging, world purview is emerging, a unification of the peoples of the world is something that seems to be essential if we get a sense of history and a sense of that. And that it's interesting to me that the story itself of Columbus, he actually, Taviani actually says, and looks at Oviedo, and Morrison also accepts the general proposition that Columbus, who was singularly driven with a sense of vision, very often these kind of people, achievers are, to move to the westward, that there was debate among the Pinzon brothers, the captains of his captains and the crew, that they really were many who were very frightened. They really did want to there was great sentiment to turn about and go back. The trade winds had been bringing them so far out, worked further than they had ever been before. And he actually did on the 9th Morrison accepts it, actually did say to the Pinzon brothers that if we do not find land, there were signs of land with logs floating with leaves or flowers and so forth. Mm-hmm. If we do not find land within 3 days, we will really give serious consideration to turning about. And on the night of the 11th, Morrison writes so dramatically, no one was asleep on those ships. All eyes were peering on the western horizon. They had seen evidence. There were birds that had brought them on a west-southwest tack for a while. They had some stormy seas that night. It had been generally smooth sailing. But all eyes were on the western horizon. And this incredible story that Columbus, at 10 o'clock, and he entered it in his log, at 10 o'clock at night, on the night of October 11th, on the far distant western horizon from the stern castle of the Santa Maria, claims to have seen a light, like a candle. This is a famous story that everyone will know. He saw a light in the far distant horizon, and it's been estimated that he would have had to have been when he saw, and he had Pedro Gutierrez, a representative of the king, come, who also saw the light. Others did not. And then it faded. And the firm landfall didn't occur until 2 a.m. in the morning, right? And when they saw the actual eclipse of what is almost certainly San Salvador. But they saw this, and that he was, it's been agreed that Columbus must have been, by all those, this has been much written about, he must have been 27 nautical miles. This is the best agreement that they can come to, where he would have been on the Santa Maria. 27 nautical miles off the eastern coast of San Salvador. And most people have said there's no possibility that any light of a torch. The peoples of the island were Indian fishing people. They ventured out. They had torches. They had fire. The height of the highest hill is 140 feet on San Salvador. But no torch could be possibly seen that far. The horizon is generally 7 miles or so as we look out. No torch could be possibly seen, but at 27 miles. But interesting, this Taviani, who is one of the leading proponents or scholars of Christopher Columbus, he and Ruth Wolper went to a spot off the island, 27 nautical miles, in a ship, under the same conditions as existed on the night of October 11th, this night that Morrison said was the most propitious and important night since the birth of Christ, as these two worlds, East and West, were about to meet, and that they had a bonfire to be built on the island. The bonfire might have been a signal for fishermen who were away. The seas were up. And they were able to see this light, just as Columbus described it in the log. And if you take that point, 27 nautical miles, you come up with a reading, longitudinal reading, of 73 degrees, 58 minutes, and 6 seconds of west longitude. 73, 58, and 6 seconds. We went to the library and did this at the New York Library. And that's a reading that you come up with. And if you, let me just make the point, if you draw that line due northward, where Columbus would have spotted this light, you draw that line due northward, it comes ashore at Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. It goes and transits through and transits Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And it crosses the East River, and we went and looked it up in the new Geodetic Survey, U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey with place names, things, and it crosses the East River at 43rd Street and bisects the world headquarters of the United Nations. It goes on to bisect Central Park, but this is the point where the East met West, and that these should go and bisect the world headquarters of the United Nations, which perhaps if we get a longer-term perspective is an institution which is the hope of the world in a certain sense. We need to have some sort of a world purview going. I think the coincidence between those two things is quite amazing if it does hold up that way. I don't know if you see that as amazing that there should be a coincidence of the point where he saw the light and the fact that this institution would have evolved, this institution which might be the hope of the world would have evolved so many hundreds of years after he made that sighting. And if we might have the basis for establishing a new point at which we would orient ourselves for the rest of our tenure on Earth in an east-west direction, other than the prime meridian that we've done at Greenwich in England. I don't know whether we could give added support to the United Nations, and if there's a rationale for dividing the Earth and demarcating the Earth on an east-west basis, since this was, after all, the meeting of East and West in a historic frame of reference. I just found it absolutely staggering that these two things would come absolutely the same, and you could look it up if anyone wanted to go and look it up, and these things hold. And no one seemed to have paid attention to that.
Well,
I wonder if it means anything or not. Maybe it doesn't.
It reminds me of a kind of story
Yes.
that Borges would write, or Calvino, in which you've got a set of events that everybody interprets according to a well-known set of parameters, and instead you find this secret underground Rosicrucian mathematical plot that explains it all quite differently.
Mm-hmm.
It could be, but it's sort of hard to really know what a thing like that means.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering. Do you think it's curious that that would be the case, and that no one's pointed it out? No one has ever pointed it out.
Well, I mean, that no one would have pointed it out is not amazing, because after all, it is somewhat recondite at this point. Does it mean something? I don't know.
I wonder what you think. What do you think?
Do I think it means something?
Yeah. Or is there? No. Okay.
I mean, I think it means that they're both more or less on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Beyond that,
You don't see it in the sort of almost romantic terms that I might be trying to...
I mean, I would like to know what is the missing premise here. I mean, what does this kind of a coincidence mean in your?
Well, I'm just saying it may be a rationale. What is the rationale by which we orient? I mean, the equator has a geophysical rationale. It's midpoint between the two poles of a rotating Earth.
Right.
Orienting ourselves east-west,
right.
There's an infinite number of lines of longitude that we could do.
Right. There really
now, we have come to accept, for some reason, Britain or Greenwich.
Right.
Now, I don't know, maybe Britain had a lot of rifles or guns or cannons in the 19th century,
right.
But it seems to me it might be overly Eurocentric to orient the whole world in an east-west. And after all, we're setting up a demarcating and a grid on this planet that is going to serve us now from the end of our tenure to the end of our tenure on Earth.
Right.
And, I mean, it doesn't have any particular rationale, such as does a coincidence of the grand meeting of the East and the West in a historically monumental sense, coinciding so exactly with the one institution in the world that we might have a movement to be able to say, let's change the prime meridian.
I follow your reasoning, but I'll just add one
paradigm-shifting notion.
One further observation.
Mm-hmm.
That once you've granted that the place where you're going to calculate latitude from, is that what it is?
Longitude. In this case. Latitude.
I'm not really good at all this sort of thing. That you're going to calculate longitude from is not physical, but is geopolitical.
Well, that would be.
Then any number of arguments will come into view. And everybody who has a strong political view of the geographical history of the world will be able to take their readings. At the moment, the stock of the Columbian event is very seriously down.
I know.
And so that if you wanted to propose this in the terms that you were proposing it, I doubt if you would get too far.
We might be able to be the... Well, I don't know. I think there's quite
as a political enterprise.
I know it's strange, and nobody wants to do it. I mean, it's very inconvenient.
Remember, most of the times when these things have been really done well, they've been done silently.
Yeah.
When Martin Waldseemüller called it America after Amerigo Vespucci, nobody was paying any attention. It just sort of caught on when Mercator used it a generation later and divided it up into two Americas, a North and a South. There's argument that Waldseemüller only meant it to name a little province in South America, but by then it was too late. Now, that became invested with all kinds of political and quasi-religious, all sorts of ideological freight, from which it has proven impossible subsequently for many generations of revisionaries to remove it. And nobody in the history of the discovery has been more roundly and persistently undermined and attacked than Amerigo Vespucci without it budging the thing an inch. Well, I think that these kinds of things are probably hard to change, probably more important from the point of view of a humanist.
Well, I mean, I don't think...
More important to think of what they mean, how did they come to be what they are, and what do we make of them now, and to try to move them.
I didn't mean to say it would be easy to change the prime meridian. And I mean, that would be an incredible change because the world becomes adjusted to things in a paradigm way. And the question is, in the minds of many, are we at a time in human affairs that really requires or calls for a paradigm shift? Are we at a time where the traditional ways...
That would be the question.
Well, no, but could this be part of a pattern of paradigm shift or a signaling of a paradigm shift about the way we see the world? Do we want to let those of us, or who among us does, want to establish and give increased credence to to the United Nations, for instance. This would be something that would give. It would center it on the trilateral nations of the world. The other is so Eurocentric. It would give added validity to the incredible, important movement of the indigenous peoples of the New World, historically having gone 95% of the way around the world, as opposed to Europeans who had ventured virtually nowhere until Columbus. I mean, the Renaissance was coming and there was this European thing. I don't know, I just think it might have some possible significance, and I found the fact that these two things would coincide like that amazing that it would, because you go and look it up and it's exact. And if it was a couple of seconds off on either way, you'd be over in Bayonne. But to have it practically, Robert, you can practically divide the Security Council and the General Assembly.
This is the kind of thing that in the 17th century would have gotten Isaac Newton to write a book about.
Well, yeah.
The fact he wrote books about it is more far.
I would say Galileo, perhaps. You know, Galileo was very inconvenient to the geocentric view of the world when we live in a heliocentric world. I don't know. Anyway, you know.
I mean, the amazing
coincidence here on Columbus Day. The significance of Columbus Day.
Okay.
And how could we give increased benefit or increased significance to the importance of this amazing linking up of the East and West that was marked by Columbus, and to have this stuff before us. Anyway, listen, I don't want to go on. I'm just interested in that. I put it out there for what it's worth, and if you want, go look it up. It's a fact. It's a fact that these two things have this coincidence, and it's amazing. It practically splits. It goes right between the General Assembly and the Security Council in the heart of the UN. And to have that happen is, to me, amazing. But let's talk. You have a poem, an epic poem, right? And you are concerned with that. And what do you call it? You call it...
it's called An Oration upon the Most Recent Death of Christopher Columbus.
Mm-hmm. And this is a poem, incidentally, maybe I could say right at the outset, this is a poem that you're going to read. This will be aired in New York City on the 10th, the official Columbus Day, and tonight you're going to be, October 10th, 1994, you're going to be reading it downtown at the
Cornelia Street Cafe, 29 Cornelia Street, between Bleecker Street and West 4th, right off 6th Avenue.
I think we all know the Cornelius Hotel. It's a great place, great coffee house. You can get good espresso.
That's right.
You can get a good calzone, you know, and so forth.
And the Italian American Writers Association meets there every month.
All right.
On the second Saturday of every month, and has been doing so for about a year and a half. The association itself is about 3 years old. And we're having this gala performance of this long poem with some music and singing and dancing and whatnot to mark Columbus Day in a way quite different from the traditional way.
Okay. Yeah. And you've put this thing together.
I have some maps. You want to know something about it?
Yeah, I do. I want to hear some of it. In fact, you could read some segments. You can't read the whole thing because
it's much too long.
And it goes.
Well, you have to come to Cornelia Street if you want to hear the whole thing.
Cornelia Street. That would be tonight, October 10th.
That's right. 8 o'clock.
But there should be some fire put under the Columbus Day thing, and it shouldn't be just allowed to just sit there and not be celebrated in the historic, significant terms that it would, whether you're Italian or anything else. Right. Well, I think if you make it the change of the prime meridian, you'll be able to get fire under this for everybody besides just the Italians. But go ahead, read from your poem then. And again, what's the title of the poem,
It's
Robert?
called An Oration upon the Most Recent Death of Christopher Columbus.
Okay, please.
I'll just read the beginning, maybe the first 5 minutes or so.
All right, well, yeah.
I found Christopher Columbus hiding in the ashtray. What are you doing there, if you please? No one smokes, he said. Leave me alone. We used to wear a St. Christopher medal. It was for driving in the car. Then they said, there is no St. Christopher. Get rid of the medals. And we had to fly in airplanes without the protection of this non-existent saint. Plenty of people were scared of flying without said Christopher, and yet they fly. We will learn to get along without Columbus, whom we used to love so well. There's McDonald's in Columbus, but Cologne has gone to hell. In the performance, we have drunken sailors singing this part. There's an awful smell where he must dwell. We will live without Columbus, whom we used to love so well. The fact is, Columbus Day will go the way of the dinosaur, along with everything else. Meanwhile, what about Garibaldi, who was fighting for the poor of Italy, but after the revolution lived to see the rich steal Italy and starve the poor, selling them to labor gangs in Suez, shipping them to New York to dig subways in return for cheap American grain they brought back in the empty ships. The Italians went to America in steerage. That meant they slept in one room down below, seasick, for weeks. Another room would carry wheat the other way. The Italians didn't know where they were going. When they got there, the people spit at them. And Garibaldi lived to see all this begin to happen, which was his reward for helping the rich steal Italy. He should have come to New York when they asked him to fight in the Civil War and march in the Columbus Day Parade. The Americans loved Columbus in those days. He was the right kind of Italian. Not like these dirty Dagos and Guineas and Wops stick you as soon as look at you. They carry shigs in their pants, the brown-eyed bastard Italians.
I love the Italians.
The ice cream men, stilettos up their sleeves, handing your daughter the big vanilla with the handlebar mustache. Italians fixing the races at the track can get you girls, and killed Danny Shea, the Dago did, for a dirty look and 20 quid. The Americans preferred Columbus, our man who wore a telescope in his pants. They named 60 or 70 cities and towns Columbus.
That's right.
Columbia University, a country. They called a World's Fair Columbian meaning forward-looking, inventive, daring, not afraid of fools and bigots. In those days, they would sick Columbus on the priests. They would have a play in which the Inquisition said to Columbia, "The earth is flat, it says so right here in this book of theology." You know? And Columbus would stand there all smug like Galileo, signifying the progress of science and the freedom of inquiry, while the priests competed to see which of them could say the dumbest thing. People loved these plays in a Protestant country where they were afraid of priests because they hated them and found they hated priests because they were afraid of them. This particular logical slave bracelet often called itself the history of science. Nowadays, of course, this history of science has a lot more chapters than it had 100 years ago. In those days, they never heard of Auschwitz. They never heard of Hiroshima. They never thought someone could kill Lake Erie or cause the disappearance of thousands of species, the most beautiful creatures in creation. Butterflies, bluer than night, now only memories. Cats that can jump 100 feet, forgotten except by a few historians of extinction. So, of course, it is no longer so wonderful to be the patron saint of science.
The patron saint of science. Is it the patron saint of the Western Renaissance in a certain sense?
Okay.
Oh, you want more?
Just a little more.
All right, go ahead.
Italians are a family people. Not as in some political speech by our governor, for example, but as in the caves of the desolate Apennines and the frosty mountains of Gran Sasso. Family people since the days of Visigoths and Roman legionaries. Families protecting their own from the soldiers and the police, even their so-called criminals. Even their real criminals. Who were the soldiers? They were worse than criminals. They were foreign soldiers no one was watching. They came where they came and they took what they liked. People used to fight over Columbus. The Spaniards said he was Spanish. But came the quincentenary, no one wanted Columbus except the Italians. They sat in their kitchens and said, he was ours when he was rich and lovely, and he has to be ours tomorrow. Otherwise, what are we anyway when the foreign soldiers come back? I found Columbus hiding in the ashtray, so I brought him a little soup. I would sit next to him reading a book until he fell asleep. It was a house arrest that befalls even good people when they grow old and can't do anything. He's useless now, but he's still yours.
I don't think he's so useless. Do you think? I mean, it's beautiful, man. It's beautiful. I really love you. I love your writing. It's lovely as a poet, and as a that's really gorgeous. You know, I mean, people.
Do you think I'm saying that he's useless?
No, you're not saying that.
No.
You're not. You're saying he's not, and that he should be recognized in the importance that he does represent. It's interesting to me, if I may, that he represented, in a certain sense, the Western Renaissance, or the science. You said the science. You said in there that he represented science.
He was the patron. He was the patron saint of science, and in effect, of course, he represented the Renaissance at its technologically most awesome. I mean, it's certainly the case that the whole enterprise of invading the New World, which I think is the best word for it, the whole enterprise was technologically dazzling.
Yeah.
The people who engaged in it, Columbus and Verrazzano and Vespucci and Cabot and all of them, were well-trained navigators, understood a good deal about how to operate in all kinds of situations. They came from a long mercantile tradition of people who had been plying the Mediterranean and the North Sea and the coast of Africa very successfully for a very long time. He represented as well the intensive push of the Crusades as it achieved its sort of summary achievement in driving the Muslims out of Granada earlier in the same year,
1492.
In May of 1492. That's Madariaga's point that in his wonderful biography of Columbus, that in effect the discovery of the Western lands was the next chapter in the Crusades, whose Mediterranean campaigns had finally finished with this millennial event. All of those things enter into it. From the point of view of an Italian, it represents, you might call it, the critical catastrophe of the Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance made it possible, and nothing did more to dismantle the wealth and power of the Italian Renaissance than Spain's discovery.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, right.
Of course.
Yeah, that's right.
Within 60 years of Columbus's voyage, Italy had descended to the level of a Spanish colony.
Yeah, interesting.
And it remained that way for 300 years until the Risorgimento.
Venice had fallen down, and I mean the way to the east had been blocked by the by the Ottomans and so forth, and so in 1453 they'd been blocked. He was born in 1451 in Genoa, I think, probably. Right? And it was only about 25 years before Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, it is incredible the kinds of illustrious companion of the Italian Renaissance, which was the beginning of the rebirth of Europe, which had been, very much in the backwater, and they were just beginning to search. And that, in a certain sense, continues into it began 500 years ago, but that began a period of 500 years of European domination of the world, colonization. We've only gone, you were talking about, we went through this other stuff. I mean, the decolonization of the world has just occurred recently, relatively recently in the world history, and this theme about the conflict between the well-to-do or the leading elements of the world and those who are not so well-to-do is one that still plagues us, either sociologically, economically, both domestically and on an international scale. And in a certain sense, it's brought here to focus as far as Christopher Columbus, the animus directed toward him, toward the indigenous people, is something that has been taken up the plight of those who have not been so well, are not in such a position of power in the world.
I think it's also the case that the European rearrangement of the Western Hemisphere in the hundreds of years subsequent to Columbus's voyage has worn out. Things are changing. Nobody exactly knows how they're changing, but whatever happens next, it's clear that peoples who have been silent for hundreds and even thousands of years are finally managing to make their voices heard, so that all of this whole agenda of European culture and thought is up for discussion, is open to question, in a way that I think it really wasn't even 20 or 30 years ago, let alone 100 years ago.
What do you think is causing that, Bob? That rearranging. And again, if I would, I'd give you a kid. They're talking about GATT now, and World Economic Organization, and they're arguing about it in the most vociferous terms, and it's going to become a major issue as we begin to look ahead. And we have incredible discontent within our own society between the special interests and those who are well endowed and those who are not.
I think that there
are a couple of thoughts.
I think that there are many things causing it. I think that one of them can be thought of politically. The long cultural revolution that began in the 1960s has never really stopped. The ideological dismantling of Western empire is a constant project to peoples all over the world, including right in the heart of the Western empires. That's one thing. Another thing, perhaps equally consequential in these days, is the rearrangement of the map of world power. The end of the Cold War has produced a softening, really, of American ideological intensity. It doesn't seem to be quite so desperately important to be American anymore when there isn't a clear and simple antagonist, as for so many years there was. I'm not expressing any nostalgia for that, far from it. I think those things reflect large global changes. The intensification, as you mentioned before when you alluded to Marshall McLuhan and Buckminster Fuller.
God bless their souls.
The intensification of global communication has meant that people think very differently than they used to because they know different things from the things that they used to know. People's purview used to be considerably more constrained by locality and place, time, class, race, gender, all of that. Now, with the kind of complicated conversations that we really specialize in under names like multiculturalism, we're just much more aware of how things look to other people. I think I told you, I'm not sure if I told you on the phone, how this poem came to be written.
No, I don't recall.
Okay, at Brooklyn College, the week before the quincentenary, there's a group called Familia Latina, which is an umbrella group of all the Hispanic and Latino organizations on the campus, of which there's a good number, announced a day of dignity to protest the celebrations. Well, the head of the Italian American Club came to me, because, you know, I teach Italian American literature, and said, what are we going to do about this? And I said, well, let's think about it for a minute. I said, Columbus was working for the King of Spain. These people came here probably to work on the railroads. Which one do you have more in common with? Did your grandfather come here working for the King of Spain, or did he come here to work on the railroads? She said, well, that's an interesting point of view. And I said, maybe if we're really nice, and we go to Familia Latina, and we tell them how we feel, we can have a conversation, we can all protest together. And that's exactly what happened. And I wrote this poem for that occasion. It's a way of talking about the actual human complexity of our relationship with these icons, these sacred figures from the ideological history.
The I, in this case, you're talking about the Latin American and in the Italian, or are you talking about the American or the world, or what? When you say our relationship to these iconic historical figures.
Actually, all of the above. In other words, in this particular instance, I was speaking more as an Italian American than as anything else. I wasn't all that happy with the official conversation that I was hearing from some Italian American leaders. I thought they were taking a very defensive posture, as if to say, you know, don't lay hands on our sacred figure. I can understand that.
Mr. Columbus.
Right. Saint Columbus almost. And I felt that a little bit myself. I was raised as an Italian. But when we thought about it, and we all sat together and talked, the Latino students, the Italian students, faculty on both sides, we sat together. When we thought about it, we realized that, after all, the complaint that indigenous peoples, the complaint that African peoples were making about this celebration of the European triumph were sensible complaints. There wasn't any way that we could sneer at that. We knew what they were talking about.
Absolutely. Are you kidding about the Holocaust?
But what we wanted to do was to also say, look, we are not necessarily marching in the brigade of the conquistadors. The feelings that we have for Columbus are things that we inherited because he was an icon of our tribe. It's something that we really had to think about, and we still have to think about.
By the tribe, you mean European? You mean
in this particular
European? Or
I mean Italians.
Italian.
I mean Italians, because Italians in this country. Now, I'm not claiming Columbus for us, but Italians.
Well, he was an Italian.
Italians in this country, for all kinds of reasons, have made a great deal over Columbus over the past 100 years. Many of the kinds of rituals of community identification that were inherited by us in Italy, we were disinherited from here. The Catholic Church, for example, when we got here, was pretty much in the hands of an Irish hierarchy that didn't exactly want too many Italians running the show. I mean, my grandparents would talk about being sent to worship in the basement. My father likewise. My father, by the time that he was 10 years old, stopped going to church because he felt so insulted.
Well, he was a transcendent figure. Columbus was a transcendent figure in the history of the world, and again, for
us, maybe an alternative figure rather than a transcendent figure. I don't know.
Alternative figure, but he was an alternative figure. I mean, you had a number of them that came out. Michelangelo was no slouch. I mean, you had, in terms of the arts and.
But in America, he doesn't have the resonance that Columbus had.
Oh, Michelangelo doesn't have
the
resonance?
No. Remember, Italians came here principally at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century,
Right.
which was the height of the American cult of Columbus, because Columbus represented and symbolized, in terms of political history, self-justified Christian imperialism. That's really what
That's interesting.
And the Americans made a big to-do about it. So here was something Italian. As I say in the poem, he was the right kind of Italian. The Americans looked at us. My great-grandfather went back to Italy because standing in front of the reservoir on 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, he had somebody throw fruit at him and call him names, Dago, Guinea, Wop, get out of here, you don't belong here. I heard that story 1,000 times as a child. So the immigrants very much felt humiliated. They felt very left out and badly treated. And here was an Italian that the Americans could like. So it was irresistible.
Well, okay, I understand all that, and was irresistible to that, and they want to, and yet it must have been a bit disappointing to many of the Italian Americans, or Italians for that matter, that the 500th anniversary was so. It wasn't given the kind of glorious kind of representation that you might have felt it deserved, and yet it did also, I would say, underscore the fact that the sensibilities of the world had gone to a place where instead of just seeing the glory of the star Columbus coming over across the world and coming in to discover this new world and so forth, came to the sensibilities of the tremendous suffering that had been inflicted upon the indigenous peoples of this new world with smallpox, and I mean the whole thing was a tremendous Holocaust, and so there was a sensitivity among the peoples of this country and of the world to the plight of those who had been disadvantaged by the colonial expression and expansion of European power. At that time, in the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, and even continues on into the world in a present sense. We only have just come back from colonial expansion of Europe all over the world, and this is still the colonial expansion of the trilateralist countries and that sort of thing begins to create among the peoples of the world a sense of a need for some sort of elemental justice between the rich and the powerful. Those who will, those who must do as they, must do as those who are powerful would have them do. And this injustice that does exist is part of the dialogue that is going on among the human family right now in some new and different kind of way. Paradigm shift. We're heading for, and we see it in our general society here. We call it the special interests now. Whether there are various nationalities here in this country, we have a tremendous, unbelievable sense of disquietude with our political institutions, with our leadership. It's being manifest again, all over again, in election terms, and that's writ large on a world scale. There's a sensitivity, and there ought to be a sensitivity to the less advantaged peoples of the world, and to trying to establish some sort of a new system of social organization that can be more just in its ultimate outcome. To have Columbus representing the negative side of that is putting all of the weight of history on the shoulders of that man. James Joyce, an Irish poet, not Italian, but Irish, still pretty good. Irish poet who's had, and I will say this often, he had Daedalus say in the Wake, or I think it was in the Wake, he had Daedalus, or Ulysses, I'm not sure, that history is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken, which is a good term. Whether we are able to awaken or not is one of the major problems confronting us, and I can't help thinking again, the fact that the man, and with this mysterious quality to it, this poetic quality of the linking of these two extensions of mankind, the easternmost and the westernmost, and to have that point go right through the United Nations, which is a group of a gathering, an institutional gathering, that if we take a 200, 300-year perspective, we have to move toward a world of something other than just the nation states, while the political level, while the corporations run rampant with the capital and so forth. We can't, there's going to have to be some sort of countervailing measure to the inequities that exist in this world. And I can't help thinking that it might be the final resurrection of the importance of him is to tie into giving support to this institution, which he could have had no way of knowing would have had any relationship to what was going on. On that, the most momentous, as Mr. Morrison said, the most momentous night since the birth of Christ, October 11, 1492, off the Bahaman island of San Salvador, due south of where we sit and talk now.
Let me just, by way of reply to that, quote a couple of lines from this poem. It says, I look forward, much later it says, I look forward to the rise of a Columbian theology.
Mm-hmm.
Columbus, it will teach, lived 500 years in the character of a god. Once he died, he acquired a new nature as a limit. We studied the theology of Columbus to learn what are the boundaries of enterprise. And a little later it says, Columbus will inspire a cult of the carefully considered future and the reconsidered past. And the reason that these things are in there is that it seems to me that the whole conversation around the quincentenary is in itself as monumentally consequential as the Great Exposition of 1892, even though it involved very little in the way of bricks, mortar, granite, and marble.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was in a sense, it was celebrating the other side.
Yeah, well,
it was celebrating. It was
not just celebrating the other side,
but it was calling attention to the fact that people had lost as well as people had gained. There have been consequences that worked against the interests of some of the weak and poor and unadvantaged peoples in the world, and that sensitivity is widely abroad in the world now. Thanks God.
Right, right, and that Columbus probably will remain, at least for the near term, and perhaps for a very long time, the magnet of all of that conversation, which is in itself as monumental, as I said before, as all these grand, pompous wedding cakes of triumph that we had 100 years ago.
And we shouldn't put all the blame on him.
No,
People tend to find an enemy
to
cause for all the ills that have existed throughout all of history and exist today, and we shouldn't lay it all on the arms of Columbus. He was, after all, a mariner, and he was a man who did monumental things in his own time and fought against great odds and made a monumental achievement.
There is a little nursery rhyme. There is a little nursery rhyme at the end of this poem, which I would like to recite. Can I recite?
Sure, by all means. We have 5 minutes or so.
Columbus, a tiger, a priest, and a flea all went to sea in a spoon to learn if the world might be something to see even half so rotund as the moon. The tiger, he died, and the fleas and their tribes elected a congress of beasts, and Columbus was tried and convicted of bribes by a jury of Jacobin priests. Innocent victims of innocent crime abuse us wherever we dream, writing their signatures all across time and all that we wanted to seem. The last of his crew, Columbus, now goes to whiten and fade on the beach, as guilty as I am, or you, or who knows. And that is the end of the speech.
All right. Beautiful, brother. Beautiful. It's good you're getting this down. It's really good. I'm glad to have this, you know, that's really good. And we should spread that out. Yeah. We should spread out some of the glory, and we should spread out some of the blame.
Well,
and again,
I think it's a little, you know,
let's awaken from this nightmare of history if we're going to do it.
Italians in this country often feel that we're made the scapegoat.
Also, I should say,
lots of things.
The Italians shouldn't have to carry all the burden of all the nonsense that's going on in history.
Why should we be guilty? Why should we be guilty for the whole drug trade just because there are Italian gangsters? Are they the only gangsters? And why should we be guilty of this whole enterprise when, in fact, there are so many competitors for the glory?
Oh, yeah, you've got Sir
Francis. And we are greedy of it.
No. Why should you be guilty for all of the ills that have been created in the world in the name of European colonialism?
That's right.
You know, and this is there are a lot of people have tended to do, and to concentrate on that. And it's understandable because it's hard to get a hold of it in some sort of a way. There's a sense of disquietude, not only nationally, like I said to you, that is broad in a democratic sense, among the peoples of the world. There's tremendous technological capability that's not being democratized and spread out. There's tremendous problems that exist, and they exist on a world scale. And if they come to find a focus for that, upset and that nervousness and that sense of disquietude and alienation, then that focus can become very laser beam-like and become very, very difficult. And I think that happened to Mr. Columbus's image a couple years ago. We should begin to get out of that. We should begin to get past that and see what's going on at the same time that we see that the need for there being an empathetic inclusion and change in terms of a world that is going to be able to a spaceship Earth navigating vision that is going to be able to make us find elemental justice in the world for all. The trends are not good, my brother, as we begin to, if we look at it over the longer haul. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer on a large scale. The population Congress in Cairo just showed us that. Other kinds of trending that show we have fundamental problems that confront this world, and we need to address these problems. And all of the destructive capability that's built up, I would remind you, in terms of the historical experience, the technology, extended consciousness, it's not, even though the West and the downfall of the Soviet Union, it's not gone away. The knowledge base is there, the capability is there, and as an anti-entropic function in universe, mankind and the biological process might need to find a new functioning in this universe if we're not going to commit species-wide suicide. First ecological trauma, and then the weapons are there by which we might be able to destroy our species as so many other worlds in the galaxies have done. And we're at as Fritzoff Capra says, we're at a time, a transit point, a turning point of incredible importance, historic importance. Let's call upon the meeting of the East and West that Columbus represents, and I would say give support to the institution that we do have that has a global purview, that has, and we ought to give it something more than 1/2 the annual budget that the Mars candy bar has now. I mean, the United Nations needs to be supported in a way that it has not been, and the fact that Mr. Columbus spotted the land on the line due south, right to the second of where the that came to be located later, seems to me a coincidence of very great importance. We ought to take advantage of these kind of things because these are the things of history that give us guidelines, and I don't know, just make that point, but also want to invite, and be sure we invite everybody to come down and see your poem at the Cornelius Street. There'll be good espresso and cappuccino there?
There'll be all kinds of things. Cornelius Street Cafe at 8 o'clock tonight.
Okay, and that's it. And no, not at all. I don't know. We've been going on, and it is that we ought to resurrect then again the spirit of the good and the positive spirit that Columbus represents, and we're happy to have been able to do it, and to have you come in here representing among other things, the Italian American Writers Association, and a beautiful poem written on it. Happy to have been able to bring you those perceptions, and oh gosh, the work and the literature is legion. Mr. Morris and all these others are that we could show, we wanted to show. It's legion, but we wanted to do something about Columbus, and I can't help thinking that it's a particularly important day. And Robert, once again, is Robert Viscusi, who's with the CUNY Brooklyn College branch of Brooklyn College. Happy to be able to bring you his perceptions, and we in Conversations will be coming back again next week, same time. So we invite you to come in. Bob, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and how would we say good night in Italian? Could you say it again?
Buonanotte.
Buonanotte. Buonanotte to one and all. Okay, happy to buona afternoon. Buona. No, afternoon. How do you say it?
We say buonasera.
Buonasera. Okay, that's it. We'll see you next week once again, Bob. Thank you very much indeed. That's it. See you next week. Okay, well, thanks.
So how did we do?
No, we did all right. It's coming. Wait a minute, it's not done yet. We're almost done. Okay, well, it's good. It's good. It worked out pretty well, all things considered. When it was good. He's this Todd. Do you ever meet him?
Todd? Yes, I have met him. I met Todd.
I'd like if ever you get
a chance.
Is he? I bet he is. Yeah. But do you know Ruth Wolper? She lives on Sunset.